What's up, guys? This is Pete, the Carrot Man, and welcome back to the Carrot Poker Podcast. Apologies about this slight delay in episodes coming out there for a couple of weeks. I am going to make a pledge to you guys, my faithful listeners, before I go any further today, and assure you that I have decided on a regular day of the week for a Carrot Poker Podcast to come out, and that is going to be a Wednesday. So it's going to be a little midweek treat for you guys. You know, the working week is dragging on. Wednesday is kind of that day when you're not really close to the end of the week, but also you're a bit tired from the first 2 days of the working week. But guess what? Now you've got the Carrot Poker Podcast guaranteed, barring some kind of horrible thing like me being hit by a truck on a regular basis. So there you go. So it should be coming out Wednesday, kind of afternoon times, UK time, morning, Eastern time, that kind of thing. You should be seeing it show up on the iTunes feed or on YouTube even a bit sooner than that. So, yeah, I've been going through a bit of life adjustment. Sometimes life throws things at you and you've got to kind of dodge out the way and reorganize where you're going to be and stuff. So I've kind of been moving house and things like that. So that is my excuse for the lack of podcasts over the last 2 weeks. But now we're back and rolling, and I'm going to start a new chain of podcasts, or series, if you will, today, where what I'm going to be doing is, in anticipation of my poker book, The Grinder's Manual, coming out sometime in hopefully January, February latest, this year. I'd like to get out by Christmas, but, you know, disruptions and stuff, plus lack of writing enthusiasm. Man, it's hard to write a book. It just gets you kind of down doing the same thing all the time. It's tough. I really respect authors that can just churn out multiple books, especially factual ones where imagination is not like a driving factor. But anyway, kind of getting there now, and in anticipation of this book coming out, what I'd like to do is actually go through the book kind of topic by topic in podcast format, not actually spoiling like all the secrets and detail of the book, but showing you guys the structure and the roadmap of the book so that you know what to expect when you buy it. And I'll be going over, doing kind of chapter summaries, but also just like little mini lessons on each of the topics covered in the book. I won't be doing it exactly chapter by chapter. The book's going to have about 16 chapters, each with subsections in them and a lot of different topics as a comprehensive manual to online poker. But what I want to do in these podcasts is actually break the chapters up, because there'd be too much. The chapters are too extensive for me to even fit in a summary in the 25-30 minutes or less of a Carrot Poker podcast segment. So that's the idea. You can follow along, get an idea of what to expect when you buy the book, and then get all the details, you know, fleshed out if you choose to do that in the future. I'll definitely let you guys know as soon as this book is available for purchase on Amazon, where I'm planning on releasing it, and I'll give you guys all the details you need through my website, through my podcast. I'll keep you guys in the loop. Thank you for feedback I've been getting so far, for anyone that's been following along the Carrot Poker Podcast, and to make it up to you guys for your loyal listening, I'll be giving you guys more regular podcasts, like I say. Anyway, on to the topic of today. Now, in my book, there's an introduction, which is more about EV and poker, defining things like equity EV, like central notions, talking about variance, and, you know, just getting the ball rolling. And I'm actually going to skip that and not do a segment on that chapter, because I want to skip right to the technical strategic stuff. And the first segment today is going to be about opening ranges. And I want to talk you guys through how I actually think about opening hands in No Limit Hold'em. Now, the first thing to say is that the chapter 2 of the book is very much about like the way that we actually construct ranges instead of looking at one hand individually. What you really want to avoid in poker is being like this sort of clueless, headless poker chicken that's never actually designed opening ranges for each spot on the table under standard circumstances. Like if you're being dealt like 9-8 suited in the hijack and you're having to be like, should I open this hand, when you're on a very standard table or a table where you don't know anything about anyone, then you're not doing it right. You need to have actually worked out opening ranges first. So in the book, I'll go through and give you guys standard opening ranges by position, then show you guys how I'd change them for fish being at the table, three bettors being behind you. So there'll be an opening range and then an offensive and defensive sub-range, or if you like, different range that you should use. Alternate range is a good word, that you would use in the light of favourable or adverse table conditions. So I'm going to get to that later on in this podcast and talk about what those are. First of all, though, I want to sort of leave the range thing aside and think about hands individually for a second, because whether a hand falls into your opening range really depends on one thing. Is it a plus EV open? There are other things that go into this as well, like if I open this hand, can I defend enough of my range to a 3-bet, if you're actually concerned about defending optimally to 3-bets. But if you're not worried about that balance aspect and you think you can open a hand exploitatively speaking in a vacuum, then I want to talk about the sort of the factors of a hand or the qualities of a starting hand in No Limit Hold'em that actually make it plus EV to open in the first place from a certain position. So what I've done in my book is that I've given starting hands 3 scores, or scores in 3 areas if you like. And these areas are sort of in a table in the book, just to give you guys an idea of how I score hands at 100 big blind stack depth, which is the most common stack depth for No Limit Hold'em cash, which is what the book is, really setting out to deal with. So the 3 different scoring criteria that I've set here are GPP, which stands for good pair potential, firstly. A hand has good pair potential if and only if it's the kind of hand that can actually connect really well on a decent amount of flops. Now, in No Limit Hold'em, as you've probably heard and are aware of from your experience of this game, most hands miss most flops. A hand like Aces doesn't miss most flops. Well, it does in a sense. It doesn't flop a set most of the time, but it has an overpair a lot. That wouldn't really constitute missing a flop. When we say most hands miss most flops, we're talking about hands like Ace-Queen, stuff like that. Ace-Queen will normally just have high card on the flop, or there'll be a pair on the board. It won't have actually connected one of its whole cards, 2/3 of the time. Just under. So what's going on here with good pair potential is we're not looking for a hand to connect well like 80% of the time to have good pair potential. We're just saying, can it flop a good pair that figures to be ahead the vast majority of the time more often than other hands, or can it do it relatively proportionately often, like 1/3 of the time? That's pretty good. Ace King is a hand that I've scored 9 in good pair potential, Ace King suited and Ace King offsuit, because both of these hands, suited and offsuit, can flop top pair, top kicker, like just under 1/3 of the time. They can really, when they do connect with the flop, it's a monstrous connection, even though it's only just one pair, and that happens 1/3 of the time. That's quite a staggering amount, That's a lot of the time to actually have flopped one pair. It's good. Just kind of simplifying these percentages a bit here, but yeah. So good pair potential 10 are the hands Queen, Queen through Ace, Ace. These hands actually flop an overpair most of the time that they see a flop, especially Kings and Aces. Queens just over half the time. And so, well, a bit more than that actually, I think. My kind of percentages on this stuff is kind of out of practice and rusty, so forgive that. But yeah, roughly speaking, these hands are going to be flopping an overpair the vast majority of the time. So their good pair potential is 10 because the overpairs that they do flop are really, really strong. And so this is a good thing at any stack depth. At 100 BBs deep, it's actually really good because you're often not that worried about reverse implied odds with overpairs with 100 big blind stack depth. Like, sure, you'll get stacked sometimes, but you're not losing so much money at that stack depth if you do run into cooler situations that you're like losing a massive amount of the profit you win by just value betting these hands on a regular basis. If you're like 200 deep, GPP, good pair potential, would become less important. Similarly, if you were like 40 big blinds deep, GPP would become more important because just one pair is what you're looking for. When you're 40 big blinds deep, you're no longer looking to like flop a set 1 in 10 times or 1 in 9 times. You're more looking to just flop a pair often and get the money in with it if it's a decent pair that figures to dominate enough of your opponent's pairs. That's kind of what we're looking to do with those shorter stacks, which is why in tournament situations, implied odds hands like lower suited connectors and pocket pairs kind of go down in value. The lower pocket pairs, that is. So I'll score a hand like Jacks and 10s, only 7, with good pair potential, and that might seem kind of weird, like Queens is 10, but Jacks is only 7, and Jacks is just flopping top pair way less often. Though Jacks and 10s do flop decent top pairs quite a lot, there's a couple of problems with those top pairs compared to the ones flopped by Ace Queen and Ace King and things like that. Firstly, the pairs are more vulnerable because there are always like 3 overcards to them that can roll off in the turn and river. And secondly, they're just not actually flopping them all that often. They're often going to be overcards on the flop. When you have a pair of Jacks, more than half the flops are going to contain a Queen, King, or Ace, and that's going to be a bit detrimental. So top pair potential, or good pair potential of Jacks and 10s is only 7, of 9s is only 6, and of 7s and 8s is only 4, because A, they're just not flopping them that often, and B, when they do, they're very vulnerable pairs that figure to be outdrawn by a good amount of your opponent's range some percentage of the time, so your equity is not as robust as if you flop a hand like a pair of Kings on with King, Queen suited on King 6-4. So I've actually scored hands like Ace, Jack, Ace, Queen, King, Queen here, suited 8 in good pair potential and offsuit. Obviously, it's the same thing when we're talking about pairs, we're not talking about flush draws or anything. So the good pair potential of these hands is actually better than that of 10s and Jacks. That doesn't mean that Ace Queen suited is a better hand than pocket Jacks necessarily. It just means that it's scored higher on GPP, but there are other factors as well that we need to move on to. And I'll move on to the next one now, which is V for versatility. A hand is versatile if and only if it can connect with flops in a lot of different ways. So it's not just limited to whether it flops a pair or not. A hand like ace-king offsuit is not a super versatile hand. It only scores 6 in versatility. And that's because it either flops to a pair or it flops you very little. Sometimes it's versatile in the fact that it can flop showdown value on boards where it misses. If the flop's sufficiently dry and low, like 7-3-3, you open ace-king in the cutoff, get called by the big blind, you're actually going to have a lot of showdown value there. So versatility can be how well a hand can function when it misses the flop, like in showdown value. Can it still have the best hand? Can it stand action? Can it call bets and catch bluffs and get the showdown? Ace-king certainly can, so it gives it some versatility. Versatility also comes in how many different things it can flop. Can it just flop one pair, or does it commonly flop things like straight draw plus pair or flush draw? How suited and connected is the hand, basically? That gives it more versatility. A hand, for example, such as, let me just pick one here, something like Queen Jack suited is going to score a 9 for versatility, because this hand is just like super cool at flopping things that aren't pairs. Like it does a good job. It has 7 for good pair potential, GPP, but its versatility is 9 because not only can it flop those good pairs, that's like a component part of its versatility, it can also flop lots of draws and just connect with flops in a lot of good ways. And at 100 big blind stack depth, which is relatively deep, that's really good. The more ways you can connect, the better. The more options you have later in the hand, and the better the branches are in the EV tree for you. The more options you have, the more versatile your hand, the more branches have favourable sub-branches coming off them, the more good things that can happen in later streets if your opponent doesn't fold. So versatility is cool, flopping more backdoor flush draws, straight draws, pairs, showdown value, all of that kind of stuff. It's something we're definitely looking for with 100 BB stack depth. It's also something that becomes a bit less important as you become shallower stacked. Nut potential, NP, is the third and final factor that I use to score starting hands in isolation, not as part of a range. Nut potential is all about how often these hands can actually flop the nuts. The nuts does not mean one pair. Typically, my definition of the nuts is 2 pair plus, but it depends on the board. Like having 2 pair on Jack 10, 9 of all the same suit, monotone, is nowhere near as good as having 2 pair on King 6, 2, where you've just got King 6 for some reason. So 2 pair plus is a good kind of cut-off point for what constitutes the nuts in nut potential. And hands that do well in nut potential are, you guessed it, hands that can flop sets. Sets are extremely disguised, extremely strong hands that can just win a lot of money and famously do so. Most of the big pots that you win post-flop by flopping big are by flopping a set, not by flopping anything else, because they're just so disguised and so powerful. Flopping a set is monstrous. It's what we all live for. We all get a little glint in our eye when we flop a set in a 3-bet pot. And I remember like writing in my diary when I was 21 years old, and I described something in life that I really liked as being similar to flopping a set in a raised pot in poker. That's kind of how sad I was. I like to use poker analogies for life things that I really liked as well. Sure, we all do it, right? Don't deny it. You totally do it. So anyway, nut potential. Generally, pocket pairs score really well on this. Big suited cards are also going to score pretty well on this as well, because not only can they flop top pair, but they can flop the best 2 pairs, the best trips, with the best kickers and the best flushes. Connectors, suited connectors like Jack 10 suited, they're going to score like 8 with nut potential. They can flop pretty big straights that actually connect with stuff your opponents are going to play, which is really nice. They're suited, they're connected, they have good nut potential. So yeah, overall, a score of a hand is going to depend on its GPP, its good pair potential, its versatility, and its nut potential. Have a think about how different starting hands score, and that's what we're looking for with 100 BB stack depth. And good pair potential becomes more important with shallower stacks. The other 2 factors are a bit less important, especially nut potential. Nut potential, the deeper you get, is insanely important, because the deeper you get, the stronger relative hand you need, or absolute hand you need to be relatively strong. The stronger your hand is, obviously, the more money is going to go in, and the deeper you are, the more reluctant players are going to be to commit whole stacks. So you're going to need a stronger hand. It follows from that you need a stronger hand to actually beat the opponent's hand when they commit a ton of money 200 big blinds deep, more so than if they committed that money 100 big blinds deep or something like that. So that's my scoring system. I want to move on now. I'm going to leave that aside. If you buy the book, I shouldn't just assume you're going to buy the book. I hope you will, because I put a lot of work into it. I'd love you guys to read it and also pay me money for the stuff I've written. I'm not going to lie. Obviously, I want to sell the book, right? That's why I'm talking about it. But yeah, like I want to give you guys a good overview now, so that when you do buy it, you know kind of what to expect. So when you get the book, you can look at the individual scores, see whether you agree with them, like have a look at that and get stuck into really looking at opening hands in detail, because it's something that we kind of skim over, assuming it's really basic. But there's a lot that goes into it. And you discover this when you begin writing about a subject, just how much more complex it is than you thought. Okay, so Let's talk a little bit about why we raise in the first place. I'm talking about these hands and their scores with the purpose of like figuring out whether we should open them, whether we should raise them before the flop. The definition of an open is to raise as the first player in the pot who is not one of the blinds. So when there haven't been any limpers or raisers before you, when you raise, you open. So opening is good. It's better than limping for a few reasons. Well, one, it thins the field, and that's what we want to do. When we have a hand like ace-jack offsuit, we're not always going to hit the flop. We're not always going to just be able to get to showdown and win. We even want to let our opponents realize their equity post-flop. We might like flop something fairly poor, like ace-jack high on a 7-5-3 board, but it doesn't mean we don't want to c-bet and just pick up that pot and stop our opponents realizing equity or putting us in bad spots later on in the hand by betting unknown ranges at us. So in order to actually pick up the pot on the flop, whether or not we want to do that for protection or as a bluff, we need to actually have fold equity, and we know from our understanding of c-betting that the more people we see the flop with, the less fold equity we have. So you're just not going to win enough of your fair share of red line boosting pots if you don't open hands pre-flop. This is why fish lose when they open limp and play a game that's 44-11. It's bad. So I would recommend in 6-max cash you just never open limp unless you have like lots of players ahead of you who are just going to call all day, and so you want to play your hands in a more implied oddsy way. But typically speaking, you don't want to open limp because you want to thin the field. Another reason you raise pre-flop, especially from early position often, is that you just want to build the pot because your hand is big, and the more you build it pre-flop, the bigger you can bet post-flop when you're likely to have a good hand. So just straight value building. So we have thinning the field, straight value building, and here's another reason, fold equity pre-flop. Just because you open ace-4 suited under the gun, and it's part of your under the gun range, doesn't necessarily make it like for value. It doesn't necessarily mean that when you get called, you're that happy about it. If you open a hand like pocket threes under the gun, that might be part of your opening range, and whether it should or should not be kind of depends on the table and how aggressive and 3-betty the games are and how bad people are post-flop at stacking off. But in general, when you open pocket threes, you're quite happy when everyone folds, and that's because you actually have fold equity from under the gun, and that fold equity actually helps your open become more plus EV. Just because you're opening from early position does not mean that you don't want fold equity with lots of parts of your range. Sure, you're a bit bummed if you have kings and everyone folds, but you have fours and everyone folds. You know, happy days. That's probably higher EV than getting a call, depending on where the call comes from and how bad the player is that makes it. So those are the three reasons really: thinning the field, initial fold equity, and for pot building straight up value. I go into those in more detail in the book. Let's talk a little bit about how much fold equity we should expect from different positions and why we should expect less from early position. Well, people are going to fight back at us less when we're in early position, but that's outweighed by the fact that someone has a big hand way more often when we're in early position. We open a hand like 4 deuce off from under the gun. That's not going to be profitable because our fold equity just isn't enough. And how do you calculate that? Well, let's just say that every player at the table folds an average of 80% versus the open. That's kind of like a lot of hands they're playing, 20% of hands against an open. That's pretty wide, but let's say it's an active table. In that case then, you open 4 deuce off, then each player will only fold 80% of the time. And what you can do here is you can use a technique called combined probability. Apologies for YouTube viewers who are just seeing lots of weird widgets on your screen right now. Apologise for that, I didn't really prep that very well. But anyway, you can see the calculator, which helps. For those who are listening and not watching this, you don't see the calculator, but that's fine, because all we're doing is nice and simple. We're saying, okay, each player folds 80% of the time, so we're going to say 0.8 for the hijack. We're going to multiply that by 0.8 for the cutoff. We're going to multiply that again by 0.8 for the button. We're going to do it again for the small blind, and we're going to do it 1/5 and final time, times 0.8 again for the big blind. Every player folds only 32... Excuse me, I had something stuck in my throat there. Every player folds only 32.76% of the time. That's how often we get our raise through. That's how often we pick up the pot when we open our 4 deuce from under the gun. We need a lot more fold equity than that to break even on that open because we're risking 3 to win like 1.5. It's not good. It's 3 divided by 4.5 risk reward. I'm going to talk about that in the next episode next week. More on risk and reward then, but it's going to be bad and our hand does not compensate for that. The reason you can open a hand like ace-7 suited maybe from this spot on some tables is because at least that hand can make up for some of that lacking fold equity by the fact that it can connect well. It blocks you from getting 3-bet because it blocks people having aces, kings, ace-king, that kind of thing. It can actually flop decently. It has some versatility, some good pair potential and some nut potential. 4 deuce off has almost no good pair potential. Well, it has no good pair potential at all, 0. Its versatility is about 1 and its nut potential is about 1. It just doesn't score well anything. It's a terrible hand. You're under the gun, you can't open it. You're on the button, you got 2 tight players folding 80% each there. Well, now you've got 64% fold equity. 8 by 8. You want a shortcut to do this in game? Combined probability. Okay, small blindfold 70%, big blindfold 70%. What's 7 by 7? 49. They both fold 49%. All you're doing in combined probability is timesing the likelihood of A by the likelihood of B to find the likelihood of A and B both happening. It's like when you roll a dice. You've got a 1 in 6 chance of rolling a 5. You've got a 1 in 36 chance of rolling 2 5s in a row. 1 in 6 times 1 in 6. Okay, I'm going to finish up by talking a little bit about value opens versus semi-steel versus steel opens, and then move on to dynamic factors just before I wrap up actually. So 2 more things to do. So a value open would be when we open a hand like queens under the gun or king queen on the button or whatever. We expect to get called by lots of worse hands. We expect to be flopping hands that are very value bettable post flop. That's the definition of it. It's nothing to do with pre-flop equity really, because pre-flop equity does not necessarily translate into a great state of affairs. You could open pocket 3s on the button, get called by a fairly loose range and still only have like 50% equity against that range or less. That's not, or even if you had 55% equity, right, because you opened like 5s, it's not actually going to be great for you. That doesn't really make it a value open, because post flop you're going to frequently be c-betting third pair. That's the reality of it. You're not going to be value betting much post flop. So a value open is basically when you open a hand pre-flop, you'll be value betting quite often post flop, because it beats a lot of your opponent's range when you flop something with it. Then there's a semi-steel open, which would be something like when you open a hand like Jack 9 suited from the hijack. It's a semi-steel in the sense that the hand does have some value, or even Queen Jack suited, right? The hand has value, it has good pair potential, it has versatility, it has nut potential. It's a good hand, Queen Jack suited in the hijack. It's a clear open on almost all tables. But the thing about it is that it's not going to be like immediately profitable with no fold equity, and that's what makes it a semi-steel. Like if you never had any fold equity there and you were always seeing like 3-way, or you were always just seeing the flop with Jack 9 suited, like 3-way and stuff, it's probably better to just limp rather than try and build a pot to frequently miss and have to give up. If you've got no fold equity, it's not going to be profitable, but Jack 9 suited could be a good open from the hijack with a little bit of fold equity to help it along. Then a pure steel is a hand that doesn't rely solely on fold equity, because every hand can flop pot equity. Every hand is going to give you some kind of option with a made hand that you can make sometimes. So a pure steel doesn't rely solely on fold equity, but it relies on fold equity pre-flop to a greater extent than either a semi-steel or a value open do. So when you open 8-6 off in the button, yes, you can still flop 2 pair, a straight, a pair of 6s that helps you get to showdown and win, but most of the reason you open that hand is for fold equity, and if you had none at all pre-flop or post-flop, you just wouldn't open it. Finally, dynamic factors for changing your ranges. Throughout the first technical chapter of this book, which is actually chapter 2 on opening ranges that I'm talking about now, I discuss, like I say, I have a default range for each spot, just assuming you're playing in a random lower microstakes online 6max cash game, and then I talk about how you would loosen it or tighten it and why. And the reasons for tightening your opening range would be when you have to be more defensive, because people are 3-betting you. That's generally the crux of it. Being 3-bet is much worse than being flatted. Why do you think that is? Have a moment, just think about that. Why is it much worse if you get 3-bet when you open than if you get flatted? Pause the podcast if you want, formulate an answer. That's right, the reason is that, I shouldn't say that's right, because you may have got the wrong answer, it's very presumptuous of me. The reason is that when you get 3-bet, you realise no equity at all if you have to fold to it. When you get flatted, you still get the chance of being able to realise equity, know what's going, have an idea, flop enough hands that can actually give you options, basically. So it's terrible to get 3-bet if you have part of your folding range, because you just can't do anything about it. Therefore, if you're on this table where people are actually 3-betting you a lot, that's much worse than if they're just flatting you, and it creates a situation where you just have to tighten up, and you have to make sure that you're defending a significant enough portion of your opening range. So that's really only the bad factor. Another bad factor could be if you've got multiple fish who are flatting you and then just like never going anywhere. That's going to mean that you're going to have to play more of an implied oddsy kind of limping game. Like, when you play live at the casino, when you play 1-2 or whatever in the Golden Nugget downtown Las Vegas, and everyone's just limping. You've seen 8-way pots every single hand. Every hand takes about half an hour to play. You shouldn't open like Jack 8 suited there from the hijack with 2 limpers before. You should limp and just try and connect with the flop and then just outplay them post flop. That's what you need to do. So Tighten your opening ranges when either you're getting 3-bet a lot or you're just seeing mass multi-way pots every time you raise. So then you want to play a more implied odds, fair fold game, and not invest money to just burn and then give up post-flop. Unless you have a really good hand with a lot of good pair potential, GPP. Anyway, times when you want to actually loosen your pre-flop opening ranges are A, when you've got fish in the blinds to you, like you've got position on the fish who are going to be playing badly, or you're deep with bad players, you're deep with people you're in position against. Whenever you combine 2 of the 3 factors, position, stack depth, and skill advantage pre-flop, you're going to have a situation where you can widen your opening range. If you're in position against bad players, great. In position and deep, great. Deep with bad players, great. You need 2 of the 3, basically. And yeah, that's about it. That's a little overview summary of what that chapter looks like. There's loads more in that chapter I've not been able to discuss there. I'm going to move on to the second part of that now. Well, I say now, it's going to be next week that comes out, but I'm going to record the next segment now while this stuff's in my head. And next week, you're going to be listening to a segment on stealing the button and blind versus blind mainly, and we're going to be talking about redlining, like how to make sure your red line stays healthy, how to increase and improve your RFE, which is required fold equity, how to like work out whether a steal will be plus EV, and what the math looks like on that, and how you can sort of adjust it for your pot equity, and all these kind of things. So thank you for listening to Carrot Poker Podcast and putting up with that delay there. I hope to get this book out to you guys as soon as possible, and I hope to keep providing you with hopefully entertaining and educational sort of chapter overviews and concept, like cool conceptual stuff on the same material as is in the book until then. So hopefully you get a lot out of this. Continue to leave me feedback and get in touch by email. admin@carrotcorner is my email address. My site is www.carrotcorner.com, and on there you can find all the details about my private coaching as well if you'd like to work with me on your own game in private. So yeah, don't hesitate to get in touch with ideas, suggestions, comments, and all that sort of thing. And see you guys on the next one. Bye for now.
Shivers down my spine. One thought of you that knocks me right out every time. But lately I've been sleeping from an empty glass. 100 miles an hour, the wall is coming fast. When tears don't swing my way, nothing says.